So now we've come to the third level, the hood, the top portion that covers all the other parts of the trailer when it's collapsed for travel mode. What made this complicated was that I didn't have a plan, so I didn't know how to calculate how long it had to be. If I made it too short, the front edge wouldn't clear the top of the lower level walls, and if I made it too long, I'd have to cut it down in length. So I should err on making it too long. It's definitely easier to shorten something than to lengthen it. I knew that I wanted to make the front part curved so that it would be slightly more aerodynamic than a square box. If I had opted to make it curved at both ends, it would have had to be longer, and I felt that it was more important to keep it as short as possible than to maximize the aerodynamic aspect. The first step would be to make the curved beams that form the front and the top. The back was built separately and attached to the beams in a separate step. Next is footage that I took while building the hood. Beams for the top, and I've built myself this template for bending the pine strips that I've cut. So the template is a little longer than the actual total length, but it's the height that the top will be. That is 19.5 inches from this screw to this screw here. So I've got two perpendicular lines that I've made. And then there is a third screw here up front, which is 5 inches from the vertical axis. So now I'll show you what it looks like when I'm actually building this. I'm going to exercise the strips a little bit by bending them several times so that they get used to being bent so they don't break. And then I'm going to install my first strip this way. So this is what it looks like. Now we're going to glue 3 more strips to this one. Now I'm applying a strip of glue to my strip of wood. Now I'm going to spread it with my finger. And I'm going to wipe off the excess from the bottom part of the strip. And now I'm going to apply the strip to the first one. Now I'm going to clamp everything together. Now I commandeered just about every clamp I have in the house for this job. So, the beams are now complete. To make sure the beams are always correctly aligned with each other, I've drawn reference lines to indicate where to line them up. At this stage, I'll point out what you have probably noticed already. That is, these beams curve inward at the bottom. I'll say more about this later. At this point, I measured the width of the body of the camper in view of determining the width of the hood. I was making the inside of the hood 1/4 inch wider than the first and second levels. Whereas the width should have been 23 inches, the measured width was actually 23 inches and 1/8. Two reasons for this discrepancy. 4mm thick coroplast is slightly more than 1/8 of an inch thick, and the hot glue added an extra 1/16 of an inch to the actual width. This is how the third level rear wall is installed. The hinge in this case is on the inside rather than on the outside. And now we're ready to figure out how to place the beams. The color blue is bound to cause confusion. I made an error and will later change the blue for yellow coroplast. Now we're going to put this down. It gives you an idea of how the rear walls are articulated. Now I've placed one of the beams roughly in the position that it's going to be seated in, and now I'm going to be able to figure out where to screw the rear of the frame onto the upper rear wall. Now I'm going to raise the roof beam to see whether or not it clears as it goes up. Here it catches a little bit, but it's quite a bit longer than necessary, so if I cut it about here, it'll clear. Now what I want is to have it even with the bottom of the frame, so I'm going to put a mark here, and that's where I'm going to cut. Soon I will discover that the two protrusions of the frame will have to be cut off because the hood has to hide the entire frame. So in order to figure out exactly where to put the beams and how to attach the side walls to the beams and the top to the beams, I've made a temporary arrangement here where I screwed a piece of scrap coroplast to the beam, and just to see how it's going to fit, and if I raise it like this, we can see that it clears the top here. So that would be just about the right size, the right length, and that means it would be, there'd be this much extra that I'll have to cut off, and this is where it's going to screw. So I think I'm almost set there. Now the rear end of the beams have been cut to size and screwed in place. I hadn't figured this out ahead of time, but there's a gap at the top of the wall between the two beams that I needed to fill with a piece of 1/2 inch by 3/4 inch pine. Now I'm assembling the frame of level 3, the cover. I'm holding the joints together with hot glue, and when the frame is complete, I'll apply a screw to each joint. In order for all the transverse pieces to be perpendicular to the beams, I'm aligning them with the reference marks that I had previously made. Now the frame is all glued together. And we're ready to screw everything together. Pre-drilling as before. And I'm putting in 2-inch number 6 flathead screws. I'm going to apply spacers on the table at the correct height, and then I'm going to place my piece of coroplast on top of that. pieces of masking tape to secure the coroplast to the frame while I'm going to screw it in place. I was lining up the back wall with the coroplast sheet because I knew it was square. I was using 1/2" No. 5 flathead screws, and I inserted them far apart for the present, just in case I had to take the hood apart again. Now that I've screwed the panel onto the frame, to my dismay, I find out that it doesn't clear the top of the wall anymore. So what I'm going to try to do is to take these screws out and pull outwards, frontwards a little bit. Okay, well, I think it's going to work. I pulled this out and I placed a few screws on the other side here, and now it does clear. Even at this stage, I still hadn't figured out that I'd have to cut off the protruding ends of the frame. The trailer is over on its side, and I'm going to trim the coroplast in situ here. After the left wall was trimmed, I wanted the right wall to be identical. So I temporarily screwed another coroplast panel on top of the left wall and trimmed it. The right beam was flexible enough for it to accept the shape of the newly cut piece of coroplast. Well, I just realized that I'm going to have a big problem here, because what I didn't figure is that the bottom of the front here should be level with the underside of the frame, not the top side of the frame. So I'm going to have to cut, what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut these and the two sides so that the top can go all the way down to the level of the under the beam, and I'm going to have to rearrange this here so that it will be even with the roofing. So that's going to be a bugger. I should have thought of that before. So I decided that it would be necessary to cut off the ends that were sticking out. I think they were probably not necessary anyways. We'll find out later. Before you cut the roof and the beams to the correct length, make sure they are the correct length. So what I've done is that I've installed the rear wall, or the frame of the rear wall, in place where I think will be the right length. I'm screwing it temporarily in place, and then I'm going to install it on the trailer and make sure that the opening clears when the trailer is collapsed and ready to open. After having built the hood and finding out that it fit perfectly, I realized that there might be a way of reducing the length. So I spent 2 whole days modifying the shape of the front to eliminate the curve at the bottom. This allowed me to save all of 2.5 inches, just not worth the trouble. This is what it looks like now. Before screwing the hinge in place, I wanted to make sure that the 2 walls were lined up on a level plane with each other. I was able to confirm that with a straight edge. Let's look at this with the wisdom of retrospection. If you recall, I wasted 2 days changing the shape of the front of the hood to eliminate the curvature at the bottom out of fear that the edge would not clear the top of the folded down second level wall. But look here, there's lots of free space. The bottom could afford to be curved in to a certain degree. If we look at this more critically, we see that the limiting factor that dictates the length of the nose is the height of the hood at the top of the curvature. Where the beams of the hood touch the top of the wall is what determines how long the hood has to be. If I were to build another camper of this model, I would certainly modify this shape to give it some curvature at the bottom as well as at the top. The next video will be the final part of this series, and it will cover a large number of details. If you'd like to know how to obtain the construction plans or to buy one of my sailing books, go to my website, www.robertberiault.com.